I'm Fawzi Afzal Khan, and you have entered my feminist theory classroom here at Montclair State University. Of course, we're virtual, so I'm not actually physically sitting in Montclair State, which is in the state of New Jersey, but I did want to acknowledge that Montclair State is on the lands of the Lūnaapéewak First Peoples of North America, and where I am sitting in my house in Ossining, New York, is also is the home of the Sing Sing peoples, and I think it is very much it's very important that we acknowledge that, especially in these times where we are more than ever again becoming really on a world scale, right? Across borders, north and south, the awareness increasing, which I think is as a result of so many things that have been happening for a long time, but have kind of coalesced or come together in the era of COVID. And so the impulse for thinking about our past history that has led in a way to this moment, and also its convergence with the rise of authoritarian states and state machinery, including right here in the United States, where so many of us thought it was not ever going to be possible that we would see a moment like this. And hopefully it will end soon, the era of the strong man. But that it's important that we recognize the interconnectedness of all human and non-human life. Much of these interconnections we have ignored at our peril, as we are seeing, and also not looking at the phenomenon of how that the intersectionality also of race and class and gender is so important to analyze, to understand, because without that we can't really move forward in a holistic way. And we can't do that if we don't acknowledge all of the history of, the many histories of oppression against Indigenous and Native peoples around the world, including right here in our backyard. So I just wanted to say that, and of course, these intersectionalities are very much part and parcel of the knowledge making that both the deconstruction of certain kinds of knowledges and then trying to reconstruct those knowledge systems that we have inherited from a very Western and Eurocentric perspective, to reconstruct those with that acknowledgement and trying to reach out and to teach ourselves, right, about the knowledges that have been suppressed. And it is in that spirit that my dear friend, Anuj Vedia, has joined me. We both came together to create this webinar series, and we've already had the first seminar in this series a few weeks ago, which was called The Pedagogy of the Seed. And now we are today calling this session Pedagogy of Water, and you'll hear about why soon enough from our speakers, and who will be introduced by Anuj. But I'm very, very, very happy and grateful to welcome you both, Alex Wilson as well as Kim Solga, who are joining us from Canada, where I'm told it was snowing very heavily just a little while ago, right? And so very grateful that you're here. And certainly it's very important to be thinking about in terms of COVID, again, how the Navajo Nation, right, has been in the United States, right, deprived of, like most, Indigenous reservations, of access to clean water and, clean water supplies, fresh water supplies. And so therefore, they have been people who have seen the spread of the disease in a way that is incommensurate with their numbers. You can't tell people to be washing their hands when they don't have access to running water. So I want, and we'll hear more about that, the necessity of really thinking about land and water and resources and extraction and so on as part of this kind of alternative epistemological frame, and how it, we bring that into our classroom to strengthen our understanding of feminist, epistemology and feminist knowledge and feminist activism, which is part and parcel of an oppressive, impulse towards knowledge making and living in the world. And I'm very grateful to Anuj for having been part of the gender, sexuality and women's studies revolution, really, at Montclair State University. I don't know how many years ago it's been now since you were here with us, Anuj. I think in the, it was 2011 to 2016 or so, 2015, that I was also directing the program here. And that's when I had the good fortune to be able to hire you. And you came in with your fabulous energy and your absolute dedication and love for all life forms and all sort of alternative and original ways of thinking through our common problems. And you brought that energy and the smarts and the heart, right? The bringing together of heart and mind and soul to re-envisioning and refashioning the program and giving it this more, this really a more progressive and more revolutionary edge than ever before. So I know that I, for one, and many others who are with the program here, including our students who may not know you, we are very grateful for your contributions to this program. And so that personal and political relationship has grown over the years. Ooh, look at the kitty cat. And I'm so happy that you have stayed in my life and brought such wonderful people together for us to share with our students in our classroom and with each other. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Anuj, and have you do the honors of introducing our speakers today.
Thank you so much, Fauzia, for that warm and generous introduction. And I was at Montclair 2013 to 2016, and I want to say that even as an adjunct, in many places, adjunct faculty feel like they're kind of on the edges of programs. I felt very much at the center, both because the students, so much of the changes in the program were actually initiated by students. We had a whole number of queer and trans students who were coming in saying, we don't see ourselves reflected in the curriculum. And they reached out to Fauzia, and Fauzia heard them and hired me and other people, brought in other people to actually change what our education is. So for me, it has felt that this relationship has always been both ways. And even though we occupy different kind of places within like the power structures of the university, right? Like Fauzia has always been invested in undoing that and in kind of building solidarity across all of these differences. So I really appreciate that as well. And I want to say, like, right now, what we are doing is through collaboration with Montclair State University and Strike University. And I am calling in from the traditional lands of the Patwin Wintun people in Northern California. And this is where University of California, Davis sits after having displaced over the last 200 years, 300 years, the native peoples from here. And so for us, Strike University is a cross UC student movement that is kind of a shadow university of the UC. And it is really about rethinking what it means. What is a public education? What is a community-based education? And it's about rethinking collectivities and thinking learning as a collective endeavor of making a life together with our human and non-human relations, right? And it is also, in a way, Strike University has also, the word strike really points to the issues of labor and collective bargaining that is also part of the ethos of Strike University. And we know also that, I mean, unions have had a long and checkered history in this country especially, but one way that we're thinking of strike in relation to unions is actually not participating in what the university wants us to participate in. So doing education in a different way, opening up the classroom like we're doing right now is one way of doing it. But we should also always remember that like the idea of a strike, of actually withholding our labor, is a really, really powerful option to make power listen to us, right? As a way of speaking truth to power. And this is something that is being thought of in relation to our elections. I'm just putting this into our chat, where numerous unions across the United States are planning for a general strike if our election results are not honored by the Republican government, right? So strike has multiple valences, and I just wanted to point out all of those. And I'm going to quickly do an introduction, and as I do bring our speakers on, I just want to have their bios up on screen so you can see. Where our speakers are coming from and what they have been up to. But in the tradition of introducing through relations, I just want to say, for me, I discovered Alex's work through the Queer Ecologies Network, which is this network out of Scandinavia. And we were reading Alex's work on two-spirit identities together as part of that network. And Alex, once again, zoomed in, or Skyped in, I think, at that point. I was in Norway for a residency. And in that conversation, I realized there's a way in which, like, what I was thinking of as queer as this sort of like all-encompassing way of thinking about the world, I had to step back in that moment and realize that queer is one way of thinking about it. It's a very Western framework. And what Alex was talking about, two-spirit identities, is from a different place and a different world making altogether. And in no way, when we say femiqueer futures, that is not in any way an attempt to subsume other ways of knowing. It's just putting these different ways of knowing into conversation. In the university, often Western ways of knowing become the dominant ways, and that's exactly what we're trying to undo here. And thinking with Alex and working with her and knowing her through my other relations, through my larval twin, Prabha Pilar, who you'll meet in the next session, has just been such an incredible blessing and gift. So welcome, Alex. And once Fauzia does her introduction, then Alex will begin.
Right, and I wanted to share with you very briefly also that Kim Solga is someone who has been part of a very important member, part of a larger network of feminist researchers and scholars and activists and artists, performers who are part of this group called the Feminist Research Group, FWG, and they are international, coming from all over the world, who work particularly on feminism and sort of feminist theory within performance studies to try to understand how we perform our genders and we perform our politics and perform them on stages as performances, but perform in the broader sense of performing who we are and performing our politics and our solidarity, which Anuj has been talking about also in the world, in the world, you know, which is itself a kind of stage, right? And so Kim has been part of that group to which I also belong, and that is part of a larger organization called the International Federation of Theater Research. And we've met, you know, we meet as a collective in different parts of the world at different universities every year. And this year we were all supposed to be in Galway in Ireland, but of course, like everything else, that was not, you know, that got canceled, or we hope postponed to next year. And, but we did hold a virtual session of our group, the Feminist Research Group, to hear about what different people are doing, how they're coping with the pandemic, but also thinking about their own work in relationship to this new and changed world that we inhabit. And Kim was one of our, main plenary speakers when we started. We had a 2-day conference, 2 or 3-day conference spread over a few weeks. And it was a pleasure really to listen to her, to have her in a way put us in our own classrooms, our own pedagogical spaces to think about these issues and think about issues like, of allyship, which is, I think, what I know that Kim is going to also talk about in terms of how she's approaching it in one of her performance studies classrooms. So we will hear from Kim after we have heard from Alex. And so I think it's going to be a very wonderful learning experience for everybody. Thank you both for agreeing to do this.
We'll pass it on to you, Alex.
Great. Thank you, Tansy.
And just before, I'm sorry, Alex, just before you start again, just a quick reminder to everybody who's here, please put any comments and thoughts that come to you as Alex is speaking and later as Kim is speaking, any questions you have, and we will try to have them address them, those questions of yours before we end the session, yeah? And we are also creating a resource list, so things that come up, they will be all part of a resource list that will later be posted, and we'll let you know somehow where they are, probably up on StrikeU, right? At some point, Anuj, yeah. Okay, sorry. Thanks, Alex.
Great, yeah, no problem. So, Wasana Santisnigasun o Pasquak o Pamaskatapan o Pasquak o Chinina. So that's where I am. I'm from Pamaskatapan, which is part of Opaskwack Cree Nation. And that's where I grew up. And today I'm at Atigameg, or it means whitefish. But in English, they call this lake Clearwater Lake. So that's what's behind me there. So this is our traditional territory on the Saskatchewan River Delta. And I'm going to share some images, but I'll try to narrate what's in the image because I know you're going to be doing a podcast later. So thank you for the invitation to be here. Up on the screen right now, you'll see an aerial view of part of the Saskatchewan River Delta. And people, when they fly here, they're always amazed because they say, all I see is water. There's over 100,000 lakes in Manitoba. And our nation, we're Swampy Cree, the Swampy Cree dialect of Cree. And this image is a whole bunch of waterways connected to a river. And yes, we have lived on this land for thousands of years. 10,000 years was the last ice age, and our stories go before that even. So we have a very intimate connection to the land. And when I say land, I also mean everything that extends from that. So water, sky, and all life, really. So if you could imagine just 2 generations ago, this was our highway, really. It's how we got our food. It's how we got knowledge. It's how we got medicine. It's how we went from place to place. And it's really what sustained us for so many years. And if you can think of the ways that we might map this territory without using GPS, without using a phone, or without even using a pen or paper and a pencil, those were the ways that we related to and connected with the life-giving properties of this system. So there are many ways that we did that, through song, through story, through markers, through navigating using constellations, through recording on stone. And so there were many, many different ways that we so-called mapped our territory. But within a very short period of time, all of that changed. So if you can just take a minute to think about how you might pass on knowledge to a family member or somebody that you knew who was going to traverse this area, where you might find food or where there may be danger in the water, how would you do that? So think of the ways that you might do that. And I'll go to the next slide here. So this is in the early summer. And here would be in the middle of winter. The next slide is just a blank white sheet because in a couple of months here, it will be very common that if you took a drone up, this is what you would see is just white. So you have to think also about how our traditional ways of mapping or connecting or learning from the land weren't just kind of empirical. So there was a beyond empiricism, so a spiritual or other dimensional way of understanding how to not just survive, but thrive using that in relation with that landscape. And of course, as I mentioned, all of that has changed. So this area in the yellow, I have a slide here that's got a number of pictures on it. On the left side, there's a photo or a drawing of the colonial borders for Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, United States on the south, and then the Northwest Territories and Yukon on the north, using the longitude and latitude lines. But the Saskatchewan River Delta, it ranges all the way from the Rocky Mountains all the way to Lake Winnipeg. So it is one of the largest freshwater deltas on the planet. And it's one of the most endangered as well. And so if you look at the Amazon rainforest basin, most people know about that. They know that it's endangered. And even when I was going to high school, we learned about the Amazon rainforest and we raised money to send there, but at the very same time, we had similar issues happening in our own territory. So that just kind of speaks to like the way that education system works and the way that colonial economics work as well, because we have and still do have resource extraction, contamination of our water, and all of those things still happening in our territory, including clear cutting. So there are a number of river systems that come together that meet into the Saskatchewan River, and then it all flows east into Cedar Lake. Cedar Lake's connected to Lake Winnipeg, which all flows north into the Hudson Bay. Lake Winnipeg is the 10th largest freshwater lake on the planet, and it's the #1 endangered right now because water from North Dakota, South Dakota, the Red River area drains north into Lake Winnipeg. And because of industrial farming, phosphates from those farms, from fertilizers, drain into the river and into the lake. So the lake is almost dead now. So in our Saskatchewan River Delta, there are a number of factors that have impacted the land. One, as I mentioned, resource extraction, oil and natural gas, but also minerals, clear cutting. And then one of the biggest impacts has been the damming of the rivers by Manitoba Hydro at Grand Rapids, and then E.B. Campbell by Saskatchewan Power. So these have forever changed the river systems, and along with that have changed the lifeways of the people that rely on the rivers for food, for navigation, for fishing, for medicine, and just for spiritual sustenance. Another impact has been that all of the drainage systems, like from cities, go into the river, and there have been oil spills in the river. And then a really big impact on the system, rivers, the Delta, has been an American corporation. Does anyone want to guess what that corporation is? You can put it in the chat there if you have a guess, or turn your mic on.
Right. Exxon? No.
Exxon? No.
Mm.
It's Ducks Unlimited. Have any of you heard of Ducks Unlimited? Okay, so Ducks Unlimited has created thousands of man-made channels under the guise of protecting and creating a space for waterfowl, but in actuality, they have just damaged the land. They have driven away the waterfowl. They have changed the migration patterns. They have drained lakes, and they have impacted the muskrat populations. And also they've created all these little micro dams as well. So those are just some of the impacts on the Delta. So everything that has happened to the land, there is a parallel process that policies and practices have also impacted Indigenous bodies. And Indigenous bodies have been impacted in asymmetrical ways, meaning that women, Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people have been impacted in ways that others haven't. And we're seeing that in the murdered and missing Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people inquiry and movement to address that. And also in the increase in COVID cases in First Nations that are adjacent to or close to man camps or resource extraction camps. In my own community presently, we thought we were like the safe bubble in the world because Manitoba had really no COVID cases up until recently, but even now in my First Nation, we have 32 positive cases, which is devastating. So we're seeing the impact in the same way that the Navajo are. There are still 61 First Nations in Canada that are under boil water advisories right now, meaning all of this 100,000 lakes, and there's still First Nations that don't have clean water to drink. The next map that's on this slide here is the Range Road grid map. So even though we have the provinces with these colonial borders, within each province there are along longitude and latitude lines, it's all gridded off. And the map next to it, for each square on that grid, there's a monetary value attached. So that's the real estate grid. So it shows the two slides that I've shown so far. We started with like a aerial photo of the Saskatchewan River, which provided life and sustenance for tens of thousands of years. And that was the worth of water. Water is life. You've all probably heard that saying. But now we have this transformation of water or natural resources into megawatts of power, which equal dollars. So there's been a shift in ideology. With the shift in ideology comes a shift in ontology, which is how do we know our truth and what is truth and what is meaningful to us. Below that map is this, what is called the Canadian well and oil grid map. And in their own words, it's elegant, logical, and easy to understand. They're trying to like make this thing sound beautiful, but again, it's just showing on the map where there is natural gas and where there is oil underneath the land, underneath the surface. The next thing that I'm showing, picture I'm showing here is of clear cutting. So we're in the boreal forest. Clear cutting has impacted us. We're being clear cut at a rate that exceeds the rate of the Amazon right now. And these are old growth boreals, meaning that this forest has never been cut before on this mass level. And these trees are highly desirable because the fiber is longer and it is stronger. And there is also a housing crisis in First Nations in Canada and in northern Manitoba. In my own community alone, we have a shortage of 800 houses, meaning that not just 800 people, but 800 families potentially are in need of houses. This pile is almost 1 kilometer long, and there's enough wood in this pile to solve the housing crisis in northern Manitoba and northern Saskatchewan. But because it is high tensile and strong wood, it's made into wood chips for SBK or special craft paper. And because it's so strong, it is highly desirable for pet food bags. and for cement bags. So here's the irony of colonial economics, is that it is illegal to cut down a tree and build a house out of it in northern Manitoba. But yet our wood gets chipped and made into special craft paper and sent all over the world for cement or for pet food bags. And if you can imagine in terms of knowledge, what happens when you clear cut a forest? If those are the elders of a community, what happens to the knowledge? Who teaches the next generation of trees to be trees when all the elders are gone? So again, there's a parallel process that has happened to Indigenous people here, and that is the residential school system, for over 100 years, people were removed, First Nations people were removed from their communities with the goal of assimilating into Canadian society. And the term that we use, that's used is epistemicide, but epistemicide is the severing of knowledge. But I like to also remind people that it's also the severing of land-based knowledge. So how do people learn, how can people learn to be in relation in a good way with the land when that knowledge has been intentionally severed through policy and practice? And then again, just to give a couple of examples, this next slide shows a muskrat quota card. On the left side, on the top, it says Wilson Charlie. That was my grandfather. Already you see there's an issue here because my grandmother was also a part of this, but she's been excluded. So you can see how the colonial process has been gendered. So she's kind of already missing or silenced in this process. For every year, again, they put a grid onto our trap lines and they've attached a quota. This is at the same time as there was a reservation pass system where you needed permission from an Indian agent to leave the reserve in order to hunt or trap. And every year they're given a quota and then you had to record how many you caught. So it was a form of regulation of human bodies, regulation of our connection to land, spirituality, food, sustenance, and waterways, and then also a regulation of our bodies. And then on the right side, there's this huge carving of the Ducks Unlimited logo. And that's just to kind of show how much connected this is to ongoing colonization. This Irving Oil on the East Coast is one of the biggest oil companies in the world. The president and owner of Irving Oil used to be the CEO of Ducks Unlimited. And when he retired in the 80s, his coworkers, as a thoughtful gift, carved this giant logo trademark into the land. And in fact, nobody really noticed it until recently, because you need a drone to fly over that area to see it. So after 30 years, the logo is still so pronounced that, it's going to be there for a long time. So it's just kind of showing the connection to corporatism, multinational corporations, consumerism, and really manifest destiny, branding the land with your charter. There's some photos here that I took when I was in Scandinavia. Again, this old growth forest that is now falling over because permafrost is melting. So we're seeing the effects of climate change on the land. Here is in the North Boreal Forest here, clear cutting. And on the bottom is a mick forest. So when I asked the question, how will the next generation of trees learn to be trees? Here's the next schooling of trees. They look very different. The undergrowth, there's hardly any undergrowth. And really it's a plantation forest. The trees are much different. So all of this, yep.
One more minute, maybe you can.
Yeah, I've got 1 minute left here. So it requires an ontological shift, as I mentioned, from thinking of self in relation to shifting to self as relation. So thinking of the environment as a relation, and that is the queering. Hunt and Holmes talk about queering as a deconstructive practice focused on challenging normative knowledges, identities, behaviors, and spaces, thereby unsettling power relations and take it for granted assumptions. But my friend Kalani Young, who's a Kanaka Hawaiian scholar, describes queering as transforming poison into medicine. So for me, I think that's kind of where I'll leave off, is to challenge people to really think about how you can transform poison into medicine through queering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So much to think with and be with over there. I'll pass it on to Kim at this point.
Thanks, Anish. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by thanking Anish and Fawzia for the lovely invitation to come and speak. And I really want to thank Alex right now for a presentation that was incredibly meaningful to me, even though I'm a professor now and I've been a teacher rather than a student for almost 20 years. I learn so much from listening to my peers and colleagues and community members in the Indigenous communities that impact my world. And I'll circle back to this, but I want to say, I want to sort of put everyone's mind into the land in the spirit of what Alex was just talking about, by noting that the Saskatchewan River Delta, where Alex lives and works and and holds traditional ancestry, the same river that feeds that delta is the river I grew up on in Edmonton, Alberta, which was on the far right side of the map that you saw originally, and is also traditional Cree territory. It's probably about 1,500 kilometers from where Alex is right now, but we are connected by the history of that river. And I'm so sorry, someone is texting me, and that's a mistake. They shouldn't be doing that. We're connected by that river, and Alex is actually closer to my childhood self in that space right now than she is to me physically. I'm in Hamilton, Ontario. That's the colonial name of where I am, which is on the western edge of Lake Ontario. It is the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. It's Haudenosaunee territory. We're very close to the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. This land is governed by Treaty 3, which was signed in the late 1700s. So I am a treaty person. I'm speaking to you as a treaty person, but I also want to acknowledge that the Iroquois Confederacy dispute the borders, some of the borders of the treaty that they live in conjunction with, and so some of the land very close to my home is disputed. I want to acknowledge that, and also to say that we are also governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, which is a really important covenant that says that we all in this land, in this space where I live and make my home, will eat with one spoon from the same resources. So it is, if you think about the logic of colonial resource extraction that Alex was just sharing in her presentation, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum invites us to think of all of the resources as a bowl that we all eat from. And if we use that logic to regard our relationship to the land and one another, we cannot extract the way we have been doing. It is only when we forget that we are all eating from the same bowl with the same spoon that we are able to do that. So thank you, Alex. And now that we're in that space where we're not thinking so much about colonial borders, but rather about connectivity, let's think about what it means to do that as allies. I know that there's a wide range of humans in the Zoom room with many different intersectionalities. I come to my work as a white heterosexual cis woman who is the daughter of migrant parents who came to Canada in the 1950s from Eastern Europe. And I grew up in a working class neighborhood under working class conditions. So coming to university was a very big step for me. I'm the only person in my entire family on both sides who has a university education. So I take that very seriously in addition to my relationship to the other humans in my world here, including my Indigenous neighbors, colleagues, and friends. So I've made my career working on feminist theory and practice, as Fazia said before, and at the same time, I've been trying to think about the many different ways that feminism intersects with other practices of social justice. Feminism is not just about uplifting women, although it is that. It's also about thinking about the many ways that oppression can be challenged, and the many different kinds of community links that we can make in order to challenge those oppressions. So when I was looking at the promotional materials again for today's session, I noted that I was in the activist future. I was the activist future. So let me unpack a little bit about what that means for me. So I did my university education in feminist theory and practice at the University of Toronto after many movements around many different lands. And then I landed at the University of Texas at Austin, which is a beautiful place. I learned there about how to make performance as a public good, how to use performance as a community building tool and as a tool to challenge oppression and in the force of social justice. And I credit my many wonderful colleagues there, including Jill Dolan, who's now at Princeton, and Charlotte Canning, who remains at Austin, many others, Deborah Paredes. They changed the way I thought about the work that I was doing. And quite perfectly, I leapt from my postdoctoral work there into my first teaching job. And so my teaching has always been about using performance and my practice, my everyday practice as a feminist, filtered through performance for social justice and community good. So for me, I don't do the kind of activist work that you might associate with large-scale protests or community organizing. I have enormous respect for that, but that's not really in my wheelhouse. It's not something I'm very good at. So instead, I've placed my activist focus on the way I teach and what I do with teaching as a tool for helping the next generation of students, generations of students, to build that capacity and to think about the ways in which we can use the tools that we have to hand in the arts and humanities for social justice and community building. As my bio notes, I've been writing a blog, which I've been trying to convert into a community space that is not mine for a couple of years, called The Activist Classroom. And if you want to check it out, it's on WordPress. I'd be honored if you do. My colleague Kelsey Blair at the University of Concordia and I have been working on creating spaces for community discussion about important issues in relation to teaching and social justice there. So if you'd like to get involved, you absolutely can. So what I want to talk about now is the way in which I use my feminist lens, my commitment to social justice, my interest in decolonization, strong interest in decolonization in my classrooms right now. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the class that I'm teaching currently at the University of Western Ontario, which is in London, Ontario, probably about 115 kilometers from where I'm sitting right now. And in my bio, there's a land acknowledgement telling you what nations Western sits upon. It is Oneida, Chippewa, Lenni Lenape territory. So I'm teaching a class that is community facing. It's a community engaged learning class, and it's an introduction to what we call performance beyond theaters. And that means performance as an everyday practice, and it also means performance as protest and community engaged applied theater. My students are probably roughly your age. They're undergraduate students in the second, third, or fourth years of our theater studies program at Western. And the class is actually connected to two different organizations. It's connected to a group called City Studio, which is a nonprofit organization that works with cities around the world. There are a number of them probably in the US as well. There's one in Melbourne, there's one in Vancouver. We have one and it connects students with city workers to help them solve problems. My class is connected to London, Ontario's Community Diversity and Inclusion Strategy, and its goal is to help the city figure out how to share conversations about decolonization and allyship in the wider community. And at the same time, we're connected to a community psychology class where they're doing the exact same thing, except that they're using quantitative and qualitative data to feed us information about our community and to help us frame our performances. So this is a lot to take in if you're in first, or if you're in second, third, or fourth year as an undergraduate student. So as you can imagine, it takes careful pedagogy. It takes a lot of guidance. And for me, it also means helping students understand the ways in which we gather and share knowledge. And a big part of my classes, and this class is no exception, is helping students think about what it means to be in a classroom and learn in a traditional classroom space, and what other ways we might be together in knowledge sharing and dissemination. So Alex was talking about epistemicide and the loss of land-based knowledge. For me, a big part of teaching is getting students to understand what epistemology means in terms of our bodies, in terms of our networks to one another, and in changing that idea that knowledge in the classroom is from me to you, and instead thinking about knowledge in the classroom as a shared circular endeavor. So I want to tell you three things. I'm going to give you a quick three things that I have, that I use, three tools that I use to help students to shift their knowledge perspectives so that they're more able to do the community work that we need to do in our classes. And I'll say, I should say here, by the way, that within the umbrella of diversity and inclusion, my students this year are focusing on two pressing issues in our community, which is anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. I know that many of you are probably used to imagining Canada as this happy-dappy multicultural land, but we have a history of slavery. We have a strong history of anti-Black racism. And as Alex, of course, communicated, we have a dreadful history of genocide and both cultural and literal against Indigenous peoples. So the land you imagine as happy Canada is based entirely on the destruction of people like Alex and her ancestors. So it's something to just sort of temper your image of Justin Trudeau and his many photo ops. So the first thing that I've learned and that I do with my students is I get them to think about space. So I know that it's becoming increasingly common to hear land acknowledgements, and sometimes we roll our eyes at the land acknowledgement. But there are ways to make land acknowledgements real and personal, and to do them in a way that is honorful. And what I like to do with my students is I invite them to think about the land that is home to them. And we do some work about home, and we think about what that means. And then we spend some time investigating whose land is home. So who are the people who inhabited the land that we consider to be our home? And when we think warm thoughts, or when we think scary thoughts, or when we think nostalgic thoughts about our home, whose history on that land are we eliding? Who are we forgetting about? And can we bring those people into our perception of home? So whenever possible, I get my students to do land acknowledgement exercises where we create our own acknowledgements, and we include the Indigenous history of our communities, but also our own communities. It's important, I think, for all of us to know that we are also of this land. The colonial history that brought us here was violent and brutal, but it was also complicated. And we're here now. And as I said before, we are all treaty people, or those of us who live on ceded territories, and not all of Canada is ceded. It's important to remember that there are many unceded parts of our nation, and Vancouver is in fact unceded territory. So, but those of us who live on treaty lands, we have an obligation to recognize our relationship to, and this connects back to what Alex was saying about self in relation. So we do that work. I also spend a lot of time at the start of a semester asking my students to think about what spatial configurations have shaped their education, what it means to be in a room where the prof's at the front and you're seated in desks and maybe you're paying attention or maybe you're not, or even here in the Zoom room, right? What it means to be in little squares the way we are right now. And I know lots of us have our cameras off, and that's cool, because when I'm in a big meeting, I put my camera off for sure. And some of you might be paying close attention to me right now, and some of you might not be, and that's cool too. I just want to invite everybody to think about the spatial relation you're in right now and whether or not that promotes knowledge sharing and gathering and sharing, or whether it's not doing that work as effectively as it could. So we do a lot of meta. We think meta about space quite a bit. And I encourage my students to get used to the fact that I am not interested in being the person who says the thing that is true and then they take it in. More often than not, I learn from my students, and I try to help them get comfortable I use a variety of pedagogical techniques, and I'd be happy to share them beyond the scope of this session, to help students get comfortable knowing that their knowledge is worth sharing and holding and can be framed and shaped in relation to any number of different things that we might talk about. I also ask the important question of who has the room to speak, who has a platform and who doesn't, who feels comfortable sharing their truth, as Alex put it, and who doesn't. If you're in a room full of Caucasian students from largely middle-class families, which is broadly speaking the demographic at my university, not by any means a large majority, but a loud majority, a modest loud majority, then if you're an Indigenous person, or if you're a Black person, or if you're an Asian queer person, do you feel comfortable? And how and what does it mean if you don't? How does it impact our shared knowledge? So I work really hard to get us to think about how our positionings give us more or less platform to talk. And that becomes really important when we have to start building community. So that's the second item. 1 minute?
Kim, 1 more minute.
Okay, I'll give you the last two as one, because I've really talked about them already. The second is community. We're cultivating community relations in this class. You can't make and share knowledge about a community without that community. So opening your classroom, just as Fawzia and Anush have done here, is so important, precisely because our knowledge is, we're very privileged in the academy to have the tools of knowledge making and knowledge sharing. We must be humble enough to know that it is not about us. With knowledge comes the responsibility to share it equitably. So that is why we connect to community partners, and why we make every effort to bring those partners in regularly to share their truth in a position of authority. Students listening and knowing that, you know, those guests from our community are more authoritative in our space than I am, because they have knowledge that is otherwise not visible. And then lastly, I invite everyone to be their flawed human self. And I model that by being my flawed human self. And I got to tell you, right now under COVID, there's no way not to be. So when stuff goes really sideways, I just say, you know what, stuff just went really sideways, because I'm human and it was messy, and let's figure it out. Let's problem solve. Let's take a minute. I use a lot of journaling tools to invite students to share their difficulties as well as their successes with me. I give them marks for showing up with that information and sharing it in ways that feel comfortable to them. I don't give them marks because it's good or bad. The showing up and sharing is community building, and that's the task. So just to reiterate, I think a lot about space. I take the land acknowledgement seriously. I try to encourage students to think about the ways in which our physical space of learning impacts what we can do with knowledge. Secondly, I invite community to be a big part of our classrooms, and for my students to think of themselves as a community in the service of other communities. And then lastly, we own our flaws as part of who we are. If we can't be flawed, if we can't be wrong, we can never lead or move forward. And I think that's also something that I want to actually just leave with you all as voting age humans living in the United States of America. If your leader isn't willing to be flawed or wrong, they are not equipped to be a leader, because that is flawedness and wrongness are the nature of human being, and owning it is what makes us grow. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. So much energy between those two pieces, and we might run over a little bit, so I know folks have to leave. I know Fawzia does 5 minutes in, but maybe for folks who can't stay, we can continue. Fawzia, if you have any questions, there's one question I'd like to ask both Kim and Alex, which is really, Fawzia, did you have anything first? Because I know you're on more of a time
No, please go ahead. No, I mean, I have about 10 minutes. I'll leave at 12:35 for my other class, but go ahead.
The question about working with community that Kim, you brought up, I am wondering what are the things one has to be aware of, especially in terms of the power differential between the university and the community. So Alex, in your work, if you could speak to that, like, because you have a foot in both worlds, you have a foot at the University of Saskatchewan, but also you do work in your community. And so how do you negotiate that power differential? And what do you see as the role of the university? Does the university have a role in the future?
Yeah, well, the university is located on Treaty 6 territory. So I really see the university as a guest. And so it does have a huge role, but it should be directed by the Indigenous people, and that should be the agenda. There, of course, have been tensions around that because we have these little mini nuclear reactors being built, and that Cameco, which is a major uranium mining company, is a huge sponsor. So like the whole divestment movement's really important right now. So I think there's possibility. It's one of the reasons why I do land-based education. So I don't actually I'm not on the campus very often. I'm out on the land, and like that's by design. So I think there are ways to kind of hack the system, and use the privilege that we have as faculty or as students to kind of demand the direction that the university is going. Right now, the University of Saskatchewan, we're dealing with like reconciliation, which we know doesn't really work, but we're really forcing them to face institutional racism and other forms of oppression right now.
It's a really good question, Anuj. And from my perspective as a professor who encourages allyship and responsible allyship, it's a tough one because it's very easy to slide from working with community to instrumentalizing members of the community to give you knowledge that you could otherwise find elsewhere. And I know that everyone in the US, thoughtful allies in the US, are very aware of what it means to say, for example, to a Black person, tell me all about your oppression so I can learn. Yeah. An extraordinary amount of emotional labor, and it's unpaid labor, and it's labor that a lot of our IBPOC colleagues simply have to do too much of. So I can speak, so sort of broadly, it's something that I think requires care and requires the constant questioning of one's motives and the constant assessing of one's resources. I have a wonderful colleague here in southwestern Ontario in the Mississauga of the New Credit Territory Zone called Rick Knowles, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Guelph, which is about 40 kilometers north of me right now. And he taught me when I was younger two very important questions to ask of any project. Who benefits and who is at risk? Who's doing the work and who's reaping the reward? So I think whenever we engage in any community project, we have to think about those things. And we have to think about the labor that's required, both on our end, who's doing the work of creating community connections on behalf of students or on behalf of the university, and what are we asking of community members in terms of their labor. The course that I'm teaching right now and similar courses I've taught in the past are governed by ethics protocols that operate at the university level. Those are flawed in many ways because they've come from a place of colonial knowledge, but at the same time they prompt useful questioning, useful, thoughtful questioning. So in the very act of going through the process of getting ethics approval from our university for this project, we're invited to think about questions like, who is at risk? How are we compensating the people who are doing work on our behalf? So on. For the class that I'm teaching immediately, we work with City Studio precisely because it is the job of the settler allies, and they're of a variety of backgrounds, but the settler allies who run City Studio London to help us make connections with people at the City of London who are then also connected to community leaders who already through that network are engaged in work that they're compensated for. Sometimes it's monetary compensation, sometimes it's other compensation. So we have the advantage of being able to connect to community leaders who already inhabit and expect to labor in that role. And they give us advice and they connect us to other community members. We also bring in speakers. For example, last week, we had a group of speakers from a youth outreach organization on the Oneida Nation near the City of London, near our campus, and they came in and they shared with us. They were given our platform, and of course we sought to pay them. So our goal there was to frame them as the knowledge sharers and to ensure that they were properly compensated for that work.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add also with Anuj that this was such a rich learning opportunity for all of us, and I really very much admire the work that Alex and you, Kim, as an ally, really are doing in your, classroom space, but also redefining what the classroom is, right? I mean, not as this kind of sealed off ivory tower, let's, instead of have this one figure who passes on the knowledge, but questioning knowledge making, right? Questioning how we get to know what we know. And I think that has to be built into our methodologies within classrooms that are, especially classrooms like, dedicated to thinking and rethinking and redefining what progressive work in feminist studies, for example, needs to look like. And I mean, I was just thinking when Alex was also speaking earlier and sort of describing the kind of water, the building of dams and the resource extraction and all of that, that there are so many ways to then build solidarity, which is what allyship is about that you're talking, right? And, certainly looking at where these experiences are similar, even as they're happening in different spaces to different peoples. And of course, you can't help but think of India and the big dam movement in India and people like Arundhati Roy, for example, writing about that and, also working as allies with people who are actually affected on those lands that are then submerged underwater when the big dams come, and, what doing that kind of work means. So I think paying attention also to building precisely relationality and relationships, which is why these kind of spaces are so important and call attention to, but really, learning as much as we can about similar, movements that connect, and then connecting with the people that are involved in those movements in whatever way, right? I mean, to me, all of that came to your point is, these are all forms of activism, that activism isn't only about necessarily about taking a protest to the streets, but also equipping ourselves, our students, our communities with these thinking skills, right? To question what we do. So I think you've both, between you, as Anuj was saying, sort of drawn attention to these, again, very important, drawing these important connections, I think, between knowledge and activism, and rethinking knowledge itself becomes a new way of sort of, doing a certain kind of activism.
I just want to add for the folks who are here, while for me activism does take many different forms, and I am especially keen to help students understand that they can imagine themselves to be activists. You don't have to be on the Washington Mall with a placard to be an activist. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I also want to, I saw Alex put the Idle No More link in the chat. I want to acknowledge that a lot of the hard work of physical protest-based activism in Canada is done by Indigenous people, especially around land and water rights protection, especially around pipeline resource extraction. So that is especially hard work, and it's especially emotionally and physically consuming work, and it is done disproportionately by Indigenous people right now. So although
absolutely,
I just want to acknowledge that. Yeah.
No,
Alex,
absolutely.
maybe you could speak to the work you've done with I Don't Know More, but also like in terms of the thing you ended your talk with, which was turning poison into medicine. It feels like activist magic, and really like a queer. I love that framing, and if you could maybe in relation to I Don't Know More as well, how you see it in terms of how those things come together in the work you're doing.
Sure, yeah. Well, if people don't know, I Don't Know More is a movement that started in 2012. It was started by 4 women in Saskatchewan, and then it quickly grew across Canada and elsewhere to address the erosion of treaty rights and then the erosion of environmental protection, particularly in 2 bills that were being passed, but there were 6 calls to action around protection of land, water, treaty rights, and addressing the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women.
Yeah.
And as we started out on that, we quickly realized that housing was a big issue too. So I've been working on the One House, Many Nations campaign. And that's a way that we've all kind of collaborated. And it started as an educational campaign just to let people know like the housing crisis is so huge. And then we decided, well, let's just do something about it. We thought, well, we'll just build a house. How hard can it be? Naively. But a lot of people helped, and we raised money and we built a house in 3 weeks. And then from that, we developed a process. And we've got architects and community builders and everybody now working on One House, Many Nations. And the idea is that it's a process that anybody can do. So I like to share that example because it's kind of spreading across Canada and elsewhere to kind of pool your time and energy and address something locally, but also, you know, be allies globally. So what's the big issue, pressing issue in where you are right now? Where does your water come from? Always ask that when I go somewhere. Where does your water come from? And most people will say, well, the tap, you know. So to really think locally, but then link it to other global issues.
Yeah.
And I know with the fires here, we think of the fires as affecting the forests and the air quality, but in the end, what we're seeing in California is the fires are causing mercury from the ground to evaporate, and then it comes back down with the ash, and it's also affecting our water systems. Everything is interconnected in the end, as you mentioned.
Right.
Yeah.
I do have to run, unfortunately, and I appreciate once again everybody's time, especially Alex and Kim. Alex, very happy to finally meet you in person. Had heard so much about you and your work, and Kim, it was just wonderful to listen to you and to really think about, and I'm going to go and check out your website. And I know students wanted to know where they can follow you. So I was just suggesting, well, you can be followed on that. And maybe Alex has maybe a Twitter handle or something I would love to share with my students. But I know that this kind of work and sharing that you're doing really is so important, and it means such a lot to all of us and to our students. So I'm really very grateful. And this idea of challenging, you know, that we're trying to do to challenge the way we know things, so that we can make room for these alternative knowledges that have been submerged at great human cost, right? So very much appreciate that work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex and Kim.
I'll send you links to me. Alex, thank you so much. Your presentation is really terrific and a wonderful learning opportunity for me.
Indeed. Thank you all. Thank you, Anuj. Thank you, Willow. Thank you so much for staying with us.
Thank you, Willow.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Alex. Lovely to meet you both. And thanks with you.